Today, I want to welcome Jack Cohen. He is the founder and CEO of Dark Knight Ventures. Jack helps executives and entrepreneurs accelerate growth through strategic consulting and investment. With over 40 years of experience in commercial real estate and finance, Jack has guided countless businesses towards success. More importantly, he's taken some of those nuggets and he's put it in a book called The Freedom Frameworks, which gives over 60 practical business frameworks for career success that he uses in his own decision making. Jack and I have been chatting over the last few minutes, and I am looking forward to this conversation. Jack, welcome.
Greg, thank you. I'm excited to be here and excited to continue our conversation for everyone to kind of listen into.
Yeah. So the we were chatting, and you said something about Curious George. First off, I don't know. Do the kids today know who Curious George is?
I'm blessed that in a last year, in a 3.5 month period, I got three grandchildren. So I have my three of my four children had babies 3.5 months apart. And so I got all my Curious George books ready to go. And so whether they like it or not, my grandchildren are going to learn about Curious George.
Well, who was he, and how did he influence you?
So Curious George was a little monkey and in a zoo, and I forgot the zookeeper's name. And the series of books were always about Curious George, the monkey that was always getting in trouble because he kind of got out of his cage and he was curious about something on the other side of the fence, and he found himself in a predicament that got himself in trouble, and it was, the zookeeper that brought him back. And, obviously, as a little boy, I can't sit here and tell you that that moved me, but historically, I have always been one of those curious people. I'm interested in people, I'm interested in what they do, I'm interested in people's businesses, and that curiosity has helped me along the way. Because, one of the things I say in the book is that I think there's three keys to success in your life, in your business, in your profession. There's only three keys, but you have to do it every day. I think you have to acquire skills. I think you have to accumulate experiences. And I think you have to develop relationships. And so curiosity for education, for experiences, and for relationships has really served me well. And that's not to say all my experiences were good or all my skill acquisition was useful, but I can see where it anchored me on my path. And it wasn't conscious then. What did somebody say? Life is best understood looking backwards, but
Yeah.
really you have to live it moving forward.
Something that always has struck my curiosity is I look at cities and I think back 100, 150 years, and why did people settle here?
Yeah,
And
I wonder that all the time.
like Las Vegas, think about this. I mean, it's now, if you go to Vegas and you have a nice car, air conditioned car, it's still what, a half hour, 45 minutes to get to Lake Powell.
Yeah,
And uh, it's a complete mystery why people moved to Las Vegas and settled that.
gambling. The
Gambling.
mob, the mob and Mo Green, their Jewish accountant lawyer, and the stories about Vegas and the connection between the mob and the Jewish business community is folklore. There are books written about that. But your question's still a good one. Why is somebody in Enid, Oklahoma, where Mickey Mantle was born, right? And the other corollary to that is, imagine being a settler. Like we bitch and moan about United Airlines being late on our flight. Imagine crossing country to Vegas from Atlanta, Georgia, to in a wagon train.
Yeah.
Like over the hill. I don't know how they got over the mountains, and so yes, but maybe they were curious.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that you were talking about, you mentioned people. Have you ever, I know the answer to this. Certainly you've met people where you walked away and maybe you talked to your wife and you said something like, they didn't seem the least bit curious about me.
Oh, that happens all the time. Yeah. Yeah. It is funny about that. And sometimes people are judgmental about that. I think sometimes maybe it's just nothing more than the guy was worked up telling stories about himself, or the gal really is a narcissist and, really wants you to know them. But yes, we have that conversation. Actually, I know some people really, really well that my wife and I debate about going out with for that exact same reason.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the most intoxicating things is feeling understood.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you say that. It really is because I don't know if it's a weakness or an insecurity, but you don't have to agree with me. I'm not a control freak. I think I'm an influence freak. I really want to be heard. I want to be understood. And then you can go do whatever you want and hopefully I'll participate,
Yeah.
but I am in tune with the fact that I like to be understood. And I think a lot of people do.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that just seems like a simple thing to keep in mind, to your point about being curious. If you want to build relationships, be curious about the people you want to build the relationships with.
Yeah, really good point. Really good point. It's just it's very true. And I always find, we were talking about bombs and not, like surprises earlier. And I always find those delightful. Like you have no idea that people, did something. It's an interesting story. It's a little off point, but one of the things I have done is done sales training for real estate service companies where you have different product types and how do the guys get these people to co-conspire. And we created this concept called a red shirt. If I'm doing if we're going to all interview for something, everyone shows up in the olden days in a suit and tie with a white shirt. And then it all shifted to a suit and a tie and a light blue shirt. Well, what if you showed up as a red shirt? At the end of the day, somebody may not remember Craig or Jack, but they'll remember the guy or gal who has a red shirt on. And so the whole key to a red shirt is to tap into somebody's secret sauce. And I tell you to this day, I cannot remember the guy's name, but he ran the southern region. He was a manager. Now, in the real estate business, my dad used to say there are two types of people: deal people and no one else you need, right? You'll never make a name for yourself as a manager. Well, I thought that was silly then. I think it's silly now. So here's a guy who's a manager of a bunch of deal people who are like herding cats. And we find out in conversation of his red shirt that what does he do on the weekend? He is part of a survival search and rescue in the mountains in California. I'm sorry, what? Yeah,
Yeah.
on my free time, I get up all my stuff. I'm trained to save people. I'm medically trained and blah 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 blah. And this is a big guy, and he on the weekend works on survival. And so I refer to him, and in my head, I see a Saint Bernard. And the funny part it is, I don't know how that story came up. I can't even remember his name, but I would want to work for that guy because he shared the secret sauce about him and his personality. And so when you hear stories like that about people in a professional center setting or at a cocktail party, I love those stories and I get all excited about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you tapped into something really powerful there. So I'm a marketer and I'm always trying to figure out how to make people stand out. And some of the tough news I have to share with folks, I'm like, let's say for instance, financial advisors. Ken Fisher spends, over 100 million a year trying to convince people that he's different. He even says it in the ads, we're different. I'm like, no, there's 450,000 financial advisors. You look substantially similar to everyone else. And so it's often those things like, the red shirt items that you're talking about that are more personal that make you interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people do business with interesting people. I just think that, and it's funny, it's like I'm trying to impart this wisdom on kids coming out of college who think, yeah, I studied hard and I took this class and all that kind of, and therefore I'm valuable to your company. Dude, do you have any hobbies? No. What do you like to do? Oh, I like to do, games. Wait, like That's not interesting. Like,
Yeah.
so again, I don't know. It sounds too judgmental, but I think we are attracted to interesting people who are fun to interact with because sometimes business has ups and sometimes it has downs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I want to get to the frameworks in a couple minutes, but maybe you can help me satisfy a little bit of my own personal curiosity. So you do commercial real estate. What have you been doing in commercial real estate?
So I have been on the finance side for almost 44 years. So early in my career, we represented life insurance companies. People don't really think about this, but in business, if you think about asset and liability matching, real estate is a long-term held asset historically, and therefore life insurance companies used to finance that in order to offset their liabilities for life insurance. And so, our business in the early days, I've made three great mistakes in my life. The first one was going to work for my dad. We were called a mortgage banker, and we represented in Chicago certain life companies. If you wanted to borrow money from John Hancock in Chicago, you could not borrow for them. And so, I started with life insurance companies and the banks and pension funds and debt funds and Wall Street. And I have been a self-proclaimed canary in the coal mine in the commercial real estate finance capital markets. So my view is I'm here to help other people capitalize their projects, but it's all income producing. I know very little about residential. I forget to refinance my home when interest rates go down, right? The
Yeah.
cobbler without any shoes.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things there's one that's just really has me wondering. It's like Austin right now has 20% vacancy in its real estate. I saw that the founder of Under Armour set off to build, a new part of Baltimore, and the place is a ghost town. And part of the thing that made it a ghost town was that they started this before COVID, and then a lot of people didn't return to the office. From your perspective, what's the future for commercial real estate? Is this just a temporary dip? Is it going to recover?
Well, so you're asking a very nuanced question. So I'm going to parse it. I think office is a problem. And I think office was a problem that everyone ignored pre-COVID. And COVID, clearly, for the reason you explained, has kind of surfaced. But there were systemic problems in the age of the office stock, in the quality, in the sustainability. The tree huggers were worried about carbon footprints. There's a lot of that created problems. Setting that aside, in my almost 44 years in the business, we have had savings and loan fail. We had an Asian crisis, a Russian crisis. We had the great financial crisis. We've had bad tenants, bad lenders. None of that exists. What happened is two things. Interest rates went down, cap rates went down, and I'm going to use the term judgmentally, lazy sponsors didn't really have plans to enhance the value of their asset, and they borrowed money short term.
Mm,
They broke, if you remember in the 90s, the failure of long-term capital management. There was a book called When Genius Fails. And the punchline was match your assets with your liabilities in terms of, but everyone got greedy. And so rates coming down, cap rates coming down, borrow short, and I'll flip the property. All of a sudden, maybe because of COVID and the PPP payments, we had lots of inflation. Fed stepped in and spiked interest rates. Well, you spike interest rates, all that short-term borrowing was floating rate. And what's happened is that the sponsor, the building, can't afford the debt service, and they don't have enough capital to be able to refinance the property. So you have across the country really good borrowers, largely, really good assets, largely, really good markets, largely, with capital stacks upside down. And so some of the things we do with some of the companies that I work with is to help refinance and recapitalize those assets. But you are right, office is an issue, and that's going to take some time.
is it something that's just going to kind of over time, eventually our appetite for the office space will match the inventory?
Yes and no. I think a couple of things have to happen. In Chicago, in particular, I was talking to a friend and client who's a suburban developer, and what's happening in Chicago is something like either 10% of the stock or like 100 million feet, a lot of square feet, is being taken to the ground. And it'll be land value for a while, and something will get redeveloped. So if we reduce the stock, that's one thing. If we change the purpose, so some cities like Manhattan are trying to convert office to apartment, and that's not always going to work. But the third thing that is actually likely to happen is exactly what you suggested, is offices will actually change the environmental experience for their employees who will want to come back to the office, and we will reuse office differently. I'm a little older than you, but when I got into the real world in Chicago, the average square footage per person was like 400 square feet. Pre-COVID, it got down to 100 square feet per capita because of hoteling and cubes and all these other stuff. And before COVID, Google made a big splash with their campus. And yeah, you can work outside and the Wi-Fi works in the gym or whatever. And what they were really trying to do is enhance the environment for the employee. Then work from home came and everyone says, well, wait, this is easy. I can do my laundry. I can walk the dog. I can talk on the phone. I'm way more which is crap. It's not the case, right? People are social animals. They need to be working together in cohorts and collaborate. So it will take some time, but there is some dramatic stuff. There's too much stock, there's obsolete stock, and on top of it, we need to get demand and supply back in place.
Yeah. The other thing that I've seen this for decades, and my brain, it hurts my brain. I don't understand it. I'll see a brand new office space open. They'll build, a couple 100,000 square feet, and it's empty. You go to try to write a lease, and they're like, these are our rates. And you're like, that's too expensive. Can you offer lower? And they're like, nope, nope. And I've seen buildings sit empty for like 2 or 3 years because they wouldn't drop the rates. It's not that they didn't have interest. And I can't figure that out. I'm like, how is this a winning proposition for you to be servicing that debt for 2 or 3 years with no revenue?
Yeah, and I've learned in the real estate business is you can't legislate against greed or stupidity. And the industry is chock full of both. You're right. It's a stupid business decision that shouldn't be.
Okay. All right. I thought maybe I was missing something profound.
No, but what I thought you were going to say, which is, I don't mean this as horrible sounds, but it's almost like a Ponzi scheme. In Chicago, what was happening is somebody in a good building, a law firm, a developer would go to them and say, Craig, you're a law firm. I'd like to be my anchor tenant in my building that I'm going to develop, and you'll move in 5 years. And you'll say, well, wait a minute, I just moved in 2 years ago. In this, like the space. Yeah, but I'm going to give you money. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you that. And there became this shell game that created a soft submarket of sub-vacancy, subleasing. And no one paid attention to any of that because it was a shiny object. Oh, new building, new anchor tenant. Isn't this all wonderful? And then the other mistake we made is, unlike any other asset type, in office, we started spending money for our tenant on their inside of their space, right? You move into an apartment building, it's paint and carpet. Industrial building, it's paint and carpet on 5% of the building, right? But it got to a point in LA where the building costs less than 150 bucks a foot, shell and core, to build it, and the tenant improvement costs were almost 200. Well, that's not sustainable. What everyone should understand is the market is too soft. If we're bribing our tenants with that kind of lucrative reasons to move in, it's no longer an economically viable asset class. And that has to flush through. I think the minute you say, Craig, you can have this space, it's $10 a foot, and I don't care what you put in your building, Now Craig's not going to move when the next developer comes by and says, "Can I take you as my anchor tenant?" Because you've invested in your space.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's pivot and let's talk about these frameworks, 60 practical business frameworks. What are those? How did you develop them and how do you use them?
So I'll give you a metaphor first. As, as we were chatting about before, I confess I have a superhero complex. And my favorite superhero is Batman. Why? He had no superpowers. He was blessed with intellectual and economic resources. And what did he do? He used those two to create tools to affix to his utility belt to help others on their journey. And I thought, what a cool construct and metaphor for a business consulting business where you could help others optimize their journey. But in order to do that, you kind of had to have tools to affix to your utility belt. So I'm in high school and I'm looking around in my class and I'm realizing I'm not the dumbest person in the class, but I'm certainly not innately the smartest. So what I'm going to do is outwork everyone. And how am I going to do that? I'm going to learn something about time management. So literally in middle school, I started studying time management. So for, the first framework I that I curated was how I could accomplish more with less perceived less resources. And over the last 50 years, I have accumulated these frameworks. Some of them I made up, others I was taught, and some I even stole. And on that basis, these were frameworks that I used to manage me, to manage others, to manage teams, to manage businesses. And with it, fast forward, I have been blessed to be asked on industry associations at conferences to run roundtables. And I had this idea. The idea was, why don't I facilitate a discussion with young professionals? So off Broadway, private room, young professionals, 25 to 35 years old. What do you guys want to talk about? And no question, a third of their questions were about career development, career management. And so I don't know why I got this bug up my rectal cavity and concluded, what if I inventory all these frameworks? And I started putting in writing stories about these frameworks, stories where I, as a man, failed, or a father failed, or stories about my children, things that I used the framework for. And I organized them really targeting the young professional to give them a workbook for career management, self-efficacy skills. So some of it is time management, some of it's how to run a meeting, but a lot of it is how to think about beginning with the end in mind and creating pull energy for yourself so that you can come up with a career development plan for yourself, whether you're a young professional or perish the thought middle age and decide you want to go from being a lawyer to a real estate developer or whatever it may be. So it's really been, although it wasn't conscious, it was a life's journey. And I kind of realized that life is best understood looking backwards, but all of us have to live it going forward. And my thought was, well, can I help optimize people's journey by giving them some stories and an easy workbook to learn some of this stuff?
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, basically, you're able to get with these tools, you're able to get more work done with less effort. Would that be one way of putting it?
Yeah, for sure. And you can be more self-sufficient, right? I think everyone focuses on outcomes, but rarely do they think about the source activities. Michael Jordan famously said one time, you'll miss 100% of the shots that you don't take, right? And so the idea was there was a lot of practice that went in, a lot of source activities that by the time he got to the game and won all those championships, everyone focused on the outcome. Well, I think a lot of people say, I want that, but they don't know how to get there. And so these are tools and frameworks to help them have the journey, right? Freedom frameworks. What I value most in life was freedom. My own, I protect it for myself and for those that are in my orbit. And how do you be free? You have to be responsible, but you have to be independent and self-sufficient. And I don't mean that economically. I mean that with your skills, with your relationships, with your experiences. And now how can we be on this journey? And so I have different metaphors and different frameworks that help explain good times, bad times. I'll give you a silly example. As one of these women in the roundtable asked, I'd like to talk about burnout. And I let these kids talk about burnout, and it was really kind of fascinating to listen to. And then they wanted my input. I said, no, no, you don't want my input. Yeah, no, we really do. I said, no, no, I'm not, I'm here to facilitate. So they boxed me in a corner, and I said, look, Jim Lurer was the head coach for Jimmy Connors. Remember, Jimmy Connors was the tennis, first bad boy of tennis.
Yeah, the
And
angry guy.
right. And in the book, Jim Lurer said, high stakes professional athletes are not overstressed, they're under recovered. He encouraged Jimmy Connors to do those antics to blow off steam. And what I tried to explain to everyone is we need to ebb and flow about our stress and our recovery. Too much of us want to achieve something and we work, 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 and we burn out. Where are we working about the, if you believe it's a sine wave and the peaks are our stress and our troughs are recovery, what are we doing day to day for recovery strategies?
Hmm. And what would be a good recovery strategy?
Well, it depends on people. Another story, what changed your life kind of thing. I'm 10 years old and Thunderball comes out, the real James Bond, Sean Connery. And in Thunderball, he had a black belt. He flew an airplane. He drove a motorcycle. He drove a fast boat, and he rock climbed. And I'm thinking to myself, there was the girl thing, but that was lost on me at 10 years old. But this became a bucket list of skills that I wanted to acquire as part of my arsenal. I didn't know what I was going to do. I certainly wasn't going to be a secret agent, right? How do you go do that? But fast forward, I fly a single pilot, a Citation jet. For me, flying aviation is a great recovery for me. I live in the mountains. I like to hike. I like exercise to blow off steam, but I have all this pent up energy. I have to blow it off. Other people, could do crochet or cooking or, woodwork. It doesn't really matter. But how do we weave our hobbies and those things that clear our mind? Sherlock Holmes once said, the best rest is a change of problem. So
Hmm.
whether I was getting a second degree black belt in Tamiki style Aikido, or learning to scuba dive, or learning to fly, or rock climbing, all of these were activities that caused so much focus. It cleansed my brain for the work or familial or sibling or wife or children anxiety that I have all day that is weighing me down.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think about that in the context of something I need to do is get more out into the workshop and do a little bit more woodworking because I know when I do that, my work product here is better.
And there's the whole point, because for some reason it just cleanses your brain. It's like reset on your, sometimes your computer gets all screwed up and you call IT and IT says, just reboot it. And you say, what? And they say, turn it off. Like my wife never turns her phone off. And every once in a while there's a problem, right? And I say, just turn it off and let it sit for 10 minutes. That's a reboot.
Yeah.
Woodworking for you is a reboot. Why don't
Yeah.
we do that more?
Well, that's a great tip. Jack, I could literally go another hour. This has just been amazing, but we got to wrap up. Your book, The Freedom Frameworks, where can people get that?
It's on all the platforms. It's Amazon seems to be where people are most accessing it, but Barnes and Noble and the other. It's Freedom Framework. It's Jack Cohen. Actually, next week, it's coming out in audiobook. Remember, Craig, I talked about telling stories about my kids. So my son Wyatt is going to be me talking about him in the audiobook. If that doesn't put Wyatt in therapy, I don't know what will.
Okay. That's awesome. And Jack, how can people reach you?
I have a website, Dark Knight, like Batman, darkknightventures.net. So ventures, plural. My phone number is 312-543-5872. And I'm here to help others optimize their journey.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for coming on Leaders and Legacies.
Thank you for having me, Craig. It was a delight.